All right. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with Diana.
It says Nick on your screen,
It does.
Mhm. I think your
Jeez.
f I think your friend's been,
Oh
borrowing
well.
your equipment again.
Oh well. Last night we had uh we had a long Diana. Believe this or not, if I start a podcast late at night and everyone in my house is asleep, the likelihood that it will go 2 hours is significant.
Yes, I actually know that.
And then imagine it's two Tolkien scholars, and we're talking about um, the misappropriation of J.R.R. Tolkien by our current right-wing government.
Okay, this is a 3-hour thing, and I think that if you even start explaining it to me, it'll probably take at least a half an hour.
Oh, oh yeah, it was exciting, Diana. You know,
I'm
um,
sure it was.
and I mean, I may have said derogatory things towards Peter Thiel and the misappropriation of J.R. Tolkien's Palantir into a giant system for control, the lust of power, and the domination of other people's free will as a form of generating genuine security rather than the vibrant web of relations that is the Shire's protest to the military and mechanistic exploration of nature and
I think people are
modernity.
here to hear us talk about Advent Trip.
I know. Well, you know what the best Christmas movie is?
Die Hard, I don't know.
No, Fellowship of the Ring. That's
Oh,
when they leave Rivendell for the journey to Mordor is on Christmas. Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I think the Muppet movie is probably my favorite Christmas movie. So anyway, but
Yeah.
here we are.
We're here. We're here. And it is so good to get to talk to you. I'm super pumped that we're going to get to hang out this Advent season.
Yes.
And on top of that, it's like birthing your book week for Diana. Ooh, a
Isn't it pretty?
beautiful. Yeah, it is pretty.
Yeah, and people keep asking me, "Why are there flowers on the cover of your book?" And one of the things that happened was the book is about the liturgical year, and that's the year that I'm saying is beautiful, and reintroducing it as a spiritual practice that anybody can use. But when we were talking about this with when I was talking about it with the publisher, they said, "What do you want the cover to look like?" And I said, "Well, we should probably bring in the liturgical colors." And so I sent them a whole wheel of the liturgical colors, and they said, "Well, these are really nice colors, but do you have a preference for the design?" And I said, "Something that doesn't look cheesy or churchy, and preferably something organic." And so they said, "Send us a few covers you like." And so I went to Barnes and Noble and took lots of pictures of books I liked. And they sent me back that. And they sent it back within just a very short period of time. And at that point, I then said, "I think that's the cover." So anyway, yeah, that's the liturgical colors right there.
Ooh.
Yeah, in a wash of flowers.
Look, the liturgical colors are exciting. And as someone that grew up Baptist in very low church, all of a sudden, the first time you're working at a mainline Protestant church, and one, they tell you what text you get to preach from. And you're like, but the Holy Ghost wants me to preach on my favorite ones again. Or then you're changing your outfits. And I was like, what are we changing for? I remember I was like 20 and my first time working at Disciples of Christ Church. And they're like, we're switching stoles. And I was like, I
What?
like this one. And they're like, no, it's a different season. Look at you, Baptist. My buddy Bo, who's Methodist minister, and does like the Theology and Throwdown podcast, he has different glasses that match his stole for all the liturgical seasons.
Well, that is some serious liturgical year stuff. And
Yeah.
see, I actually have, since being a layperson, I actually have like shirts and sweaters and scarves that I can wear when I preach in a church for each season. So you walk into my closet and it looks like a sacristy. But it's not because I have stoles, it's because I just literally am trying to figure out how to match the color palette in the churches where I'm preaching on any given Sunday. So anyway, here we are at the end of Pentecost, the end of ordinary time, and I have on green.
It's true.
I
It's
do.
true. Green, but you also have on mixed plaid, Diana. As someone with like 15 mixed plaid shirts in there, I feel left out. Like
I guess
we
it's my little sort of nod to allyship with the LBGTQ community. Lesbians love plaid.
there you go.
I have this on very serious word from many friends of mine.
Well, this Advent, in the class, we're going to be. It's just obviously a liturgical season, and
Yes.
your new book, "The Beautiful Year," is the liturgical year, and so maybe a place to start is for you thinking about why at this moment, as someone who's loved the cycle and been a part of the rhythm of the church for years, what was it that in this moment in our life together you wanted to have a book to journey with people through the next year?
It came from my personal experience in many ways. People ask me all the time why it is I'm still a Christian. It's a question I'm sure you get a lot too. Well, Christianity is all about bigotry and Christian nationalism and white supremacy. So why are you still a Christian? And there's a whole bunch of different things that have held me in faith. And one of those things that's held me through the years is indeed practicing the Christian year very seriously. And during the pandemic in particular, because we couldn't go to church, the only way to maintain that rhythm that being part of a community of faith provided was for me to take it seriously on my own. And so I started going through the lectionary on my own, and I was working on the early years of my Substack at that point. And so every Sunday I'd write a musing that was based around a lectionary reading. And I mean, you remember when this was happening. I started developing this really interesting interpretation of the lectionary, and that is an anti-imperial interpretation, where I started looking at the text from the point of view from outsiders, from the underside, from the view of the poor, and looking to see what the text actually said about power and what it said about the political structures and systems that were present in the world of Jesus. And before I knew it, I had this really long body of material right out of the Bible that showed a story, it revealed a story of Jesus taking down Caesar. And so that's essentially the interpretation that shows up in here is that the lectionary cycle that I take people through the whole year of readings is anti-imperial. It's very much bathed in feminist understandings, and it also has a real eye toward creation and environmentalism. So there's those, the feminist and this sort of eco theology piece are very much me, as you know that to be true. And as I read it this way, I began to think more about process theology and panentheism and all the and liberationist views of all sorts. So it was just a really interesting reading, and I thought to myself, how can I share the whole thing? And eventually my agent said, that's a really good idea, even though publishers actually hate collections of essays. And he said, is there any way we can turn this into a book? And so I worked really hard. I took 900 pieces that I'd written on Substack and had to weave them into 52 readings that they don't could flow, they flow with the Christian year. And I loved it, actually. I don't always love what I write, and this time when the book was finished, I went, "I wanna read this again." And I sat down, I reread my own book because it sounded different, as a book than it did as when I was writing it over a 3-year period for my friends through Substack.
Hmm. Yeah. And it's I got to read the book before we hung out at Theology Beer Camp,
Yeah.
which you did mention it on NPR. I had a number of people message me and go, Diana just brought up Theology Beer Camp on NPR. And I was like, wow, I didn't even have to pay her.
No, you
Um,
didn't.
and
It was so fun. The host looked at me and said, "There's a what?" It's a theology beer camp.
yeah, which next year's in Kansas City. So if you're in that area, you feel free to come hang out with us. But the getting to read it early as someone who's um, yeah, I'll just say I'm a Wednesday night fundamentalist since moving back to North Carolina, because that's where we all eat. And then you have different breakout things, and I don't get complaints from kids experiencing the most boring hour of their week. And um, oftentimes the church services, the theology doesn't make me want to stab my face, are also the ones that are slight aesthetic torture for small children. And so it's Wednesdays regular, and then sometimes on Sundays I go to Sunday school, then come home and sit on the porch and read you in lieu of a sermon while I smoke a cigar. And so I've already read there, been reading The Cottage on Sundays. And then, so hearing the way you wove it all together, and the new, sometimes I'm like, oh wait, this is new. Oh, I see how she connected this, and stuff. And one of the things that stuck out to me reading it before we got to talk about it, at camp, is like, it's not just an invitation to like the movement and flow of the Christian year. It's consciously contrasting it with the movement and flow that, if we aren't intentional about how we orient ourselves and what the seasons of a full spiritual life look like, occupies us. And you named it there, like with imperialism, or this kind of power and domination that gets expressed politically, economically, militarily. And so I wonder what it was like for you, who's had this close relationship with the liturgical year, to then bring these reflections that you've been having with a community over at the cottage, to then want to share it, right? Like, what's been happening so much in the past few weeks, as you've been talking about it, is sharing the alternative imagination of the Christian year, whether it's with Heather Cox Richardson or on NPR and such, and going, hey, I know y'all don't like the rhythm you're stuck in. I know it feels like we're missing goodness, the common good, a deep affirmation of existence and connections with our neighbor. But there's something those of us that celebrate the year have that can ground us in a different way of being. And so what is it like to try to offer that, knowing that the readers aren't going to be people who've got years of it ingrained in their soul of sorts?
Well, the two of the three bigger interviews that I did, the one on NPR and the Heather Cox Richardson interview, um, Heather has basically no experience at all of the Christian year. So I was talking to a friend who's a fellow historian, and trying to put that in context. What is it about this year? The NPR one was with a woman who is she is actually a Christian, and yet she doesn't go to quite the liturgical setting I go with. And then John Fugelsang, who was the third big interview last week, he grew up Catholic, so he was like, he knew everything I was talking about. We could have spent the entire hour actually going through all the deep technicalities of saints' days. That's how well acquainted John Fugelsang is with the Christian year. So I was really having to make those connections. And the thing that I think is so dramatic right now is that, and I make the case in the book, that we still live in the shadow, the dark shadow of the Roman way of keeping time, which is a linear system of time that is based around a solar cycle. And so we have 12 months in the year, and all of those 12 months are named after Roman festivals, Roman gods, Roman emperors, or Roman numerals. And if you go back and you look at that ancient calendar, the one that was in effect when Jesus was wandering around on the earth, if you look at that calendar, it celebrates militarism, empire, and a transactional economic system. And so I thought to myself, well, that's really funny, is that we have a 12-month calendar that's still named after all these Roman things, and we're still celebrating militarism, empire, and a transactional economic system with it. And when I sort of got that in my brain, that the way that we tell time and how we number our days and our months and our years makes a difference to how we tell the story, then I began to compare it automatically in my imagination to the Christian year, which is not linear. It's a circular or spiral system of telling time, and that it has bits of solar um, time telling in it, but it mostly is lunar. And so it's based primarily out of the remnants and the memory of the old Jewish calendar. And I I've always admired the fact that religious traditions with strong calendars often have strong senses of identity, is that people of faith who grow up with these alternative systems of counting days and time, they hold on to their sense of identity, sometimes even long after the belief system goes away. So they might not believe in it doctrinally anymore, but they still understand themselves to be Jewish or Muslim or what have you, because they keep the time as presented in their faith. And so I thought, well, what if Christians began thinking that way? What if we really understood ourselves as being a countercultural people with an alternative set of time, instead of doing basically eventually what the early church did? And that is, they took this beautiful spiritual tool that they had, that they'd inherited from the Jews, that Jesus himself followed, and they cobbled in the Roman calendar, which was the solar linear calendar, which has a whole different conception of story and time. And they basically, like everything else in fourth and fifth century Christianity, the beauty and truth of the thing got swallowed up under Rome and Roman imperialism and hierarchy. And so this is an attempt really to help people free themselves from that, and to give this completely different story by which Christians can live by, one that has nothing to do with empire, militarism, or transactional economic systems, one that's based instead on this alternative vision, which is really a never-ending spiral of love.
Yeah.
And believe me, people are much happier talking about that right now than they are talking about the Department of War and whatever else horrible thing that is happening with Christian nationalism right
Mhm.
now.
Yeah. Oh god. One of the things that I've been thinking about, knowing we're going to be spending time together in Advent, and that,
Mhm.
and really the larger thesis of your book, it reminded me of one of these threads that Charles Taylor, Catholic philosopher, talks about in his book Secular Age. And then I thought, Diana's a historian. I bet if I set this up, she'll say cool junk on the internet. Um, and so, because one of the things he talked about is how the secular age, or like late stage modernity, whatever way you want to talk about the situation we're in, one of the ways that our imagination got turned from kind of the palpable presence of the transcendent to a kind of flattened imminent plane is the occupation of more and more days by secular existence. And so he talks about kind of like what before capitalism met Christianity and changed our calendar. Um,
Mhm.
the liturgical calendar is structured around feasts and fast, high holy days. He talks about how feast that the church used to have more feasts because no one would go to a battle on a feast day, and so one of the ways the church was resisting the desire for the nation states in early modernity to battle was by introducing more feast days, and then lords that wanted to win battles said, we're getting rid of feast days because we're good Protestants. We don't need all these feast days where you don't go to war or go to work. We want less feast days. In fact, we only want one day where you're being really religious. We need the other days where you work and kill people.
I was
Uh,
going to say a lot of this was done by Protestant rulers who were trying to beat back Catholicism in the
yeah.
15th or 16th and 17th centuries. Yeah.
But what's fascinating is he's like, we were doing these things, Protestants, for like Protestant reasons. But what ultimately happens is that we're now living in a rhythm where very few spaces aren't disenchanted and occupied by the motives and engines of nationalism, militarism, economism. And
Mhm.
anyway, so I've been thinking about that because I'm using that book in a class at Luther soon, and then was reading your book, and I'm like, oh, I want I want to see what happens when Charles Taylor and Diana hang out.
Well, this kind of stuff is what happens when Diana does read Charles Taylor, because I read Charles Taylor, I read him, and his whole thesis and view of the world has had a lot of impact on me
Mhm.
as a thinker, as a person who is a historian and person who writes theology. And yet the way that I always am approaching these things is, what is the simplest way to share this with readers? And so how do you take something like you just said, from Charles Taylor, and how do you translate that into a Substack that a person on the run can read on Sunday, and that they get an entirely different vision of what it means to be Christian? And so that, in effect, has always been my teaching gift. When I was in the classroom, people used to love my intro classes because I just have some skill. We all have different skills. And one of my skills is taking something that's very complex and making it speak right to someone's heart. And so I don't know, I was self-consciously thinking about Charles Taylor, but I certainly know that thesis. And when you remind me, I think, oh yeah, I remember that. And I suppose I was floating around somewhere in my mind when was beginning to think about how to retell the story of the Christian year. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I
I can
think
give
you're
you one
extremely
good.
gifted. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, well, thanks. You can go ahead and finish that sentence.
Well, no, I really think you're extremely gifted at it, because there's like this natural habit of nerds,
Mhm.
where you think, oh, everything that is important to communicate right now probably has an a priori commitment to a graduate degree education. And therefore, I use a priori because that's what Kant did when he was introducing the two forms of critique in his early philosophy before he discovered, right, in aesthetics, this other form of judgment and aesthetic. Anyway, like you say stuff like that. And because, you eventually talked me into going on Substack. And then I'm like, well, I guess I should write some things too. And I wrote the first one I wrote, I got all these messages like, what exactly does that mean? What exactly does that mean? And I was complaining about it to a mutual friend of ours, and they're like, yeah, well, uh, you don't really have an internal Diana Butler Bass editor to tell you what's going on. And I said, you know what? I'm just going to put what I write in AI and ask it, what would Diana think is a
No, you
bit too complicated, and that it's on my job as a theologian of the church to communicate it more clearly. And then I started doing it, and then people were like, this is the clearest thing I've ever read from you. Like, it would all it started was highlight all the things that Diana would look at me and say, Trip, I think you should try saying that again.
I can't believe you did that. Oh my goodness gracious. Well, it's a nice thing to think that I might still live after I die.
Yeah, even after you die, you can tell me, Trip, stop saying concrescence and superject.
Oh, geez, yes, absolutely.
You know, I just I just get excited when I
I
see it.
know. It's really hard sometimes to pull you off the edge of that cliff.
It's
But I'm
true.
I'm happy to do it. I was gonna
You had a story you were about to say.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, you wanted some, sort of examples of what the beauty of this is. And the example I'm going to give you is not in the book. It was on my Substack this month. And I've also talked about it on a couple of podcasts. And I think it's a great example of exactly what Charles Taylor was talking about there. And certainly what I like doing in my much more popular form. And that is, I wanted to tell people about the real story about November 11th. So in Western culture, we have this thing, a holiday that developed out of celebrating Armistice Day at the end of World War I. Now, that was a good thing to celebrate, the end of a war, peace. what most people, um, and it became Remembrance Day in most of the Commonwealth. It's celebrated as sort of a general day of I guess military celebration, some other cultures, and then it's also here in the United States. It's Veterans Day, and so I always sort of, why do we have Veterans Day and Memorial Day and the 4th of July has become a military holiday? And I mean, all the militarism of the calendar has just done nothing but spread out, especially since 9/11. So in the last 20 to 25 years, our calendar has become more militaristic rather than less. And you have to, yeah, people get mad at you if you don't participate in these kinds of holidays. But so November 11th is that day. Admittedly, I will say the Canadians and the British do it better because they do remember that it's supposed to be about peace and not war. But in the United States, we don't celebrate it that way at all. We celebrate it as a holiday for the military. And I just I'm bewildered by that, partly because the reason November 11th was the day that was chosen to end World War One is there was a tradition that was somewhat observed in Europe, and that was to sign peace treaties on November 11th. And November 11th was the feast day of Saint Martin. And it had been for centuries and centuries and centuries a super popular day across Europe for celebration. And St. Martin is a really interesting guy. He was a fellow who grew up in a family with his father being a Roman soldier. And when Martin reached maturity, his father, basically just pushed him back into the army because you follow what your father did. And yet Martin was all the time really interested in Christianity. And so this is in the early 300s that this was all happening. And Martin was a little reluctant, but he listened to his father and he became part of the Roman army, and he was making his way through the ranks. When one day he was out on his horse, on patrol with his, whatever his legion, and he saw a poor man lying at the side of the street. And this is how the legend goes: the man was naked, and Martin, being a person who is interested in, compelled by the stories of Christianity, he stopped, he got down off his horse, he took his military cloak off. If you can imagine the way that this would be told in churches in the 4 and 500s, he took off his Roman military cloak. What a mark of prestige and honor and victory and Caesar, such a garment was. And he tore it in half and he wrapped the poor naked man with his cloak, and he just threw away, I guess, the other half, or I don't know what he did with the other half of his cloak. That night, he went back to his tent and he had a dream. And Jesus appeared to him in a dream and said to Martin, today, Martin has wrapped me in his garment. And Martin woke up from the dream knowing that he had to abandon his commission in the army and instead go off and become a monk. Because it was believed pretty well into the middle part of the third and fourth century, middle part of the fourth century, excuse me, that Christians were not supposed to serve in the army. It wasn't until Ambrose and Augustine in the later part of the fourth and then the early fifth century started making these cases that there was such a thing called just war, that Christians even that ever occurred to a Christian is you could not fight in the army of Caesar because you would be winning victory for a false king and not Jesus, who was the king. And so Martin got out of it. Martin literally resigned being in the army and he became a monk, and he then became a priest, was very popular in France where he served. And eventually the people in his region loved him so much. And he was known for giving away everything he had to the poor, taking care of children. He was kind of a Saint Nicholas figure. He would, literally give money to poor children all the time. And so they elevated him. They elected him as their bishop. And he is one of the few figures, pacifist figures in early church history who did not die in an arena. He actually died an old man in his 80s in his own bed, a beloved, a peacemaker, a man who resisted taking up the sword for Caesar, and an incredible model of what it meant to live a life of poverty for Jesus. And so anyway, St. Martin's Day became a wildly popular day to celebrate. It became a day to remind ourselves that it was not about making war, but that it was really about peacemaking. And that it was also a day, as I said, it was kind of a proto St. Nicholas Day, in advance of St. Nicholas Day becoming a popular holiday a few centuries on. And so it was a day of celebration around the harvest time in which you would just literally have these big parties, and you would give gifts to the poor, especially poor children. And that celebration went on for 1,000 years in Europe, maybe even longer, 1,300 years. And then in the last century, they still celebrated some in Germany. It's still a popular day, and a little bit in Holland. And I don't think that it has much of a memory in any other place besides sort of the the Saxon, the old Saxon territories right in the middle of Europe. But otherwise, it's become a military celebration through most of the world. And what a I mean, talk about what Charles Taylor was saying, and what an absolute horror that one of the days that we have in the Christian memory to celebrate a guy who resigned from Caesar's army has become a day to celebrate new imperial armies. And I just that makes me so mad. And and so I reminded people of that this year, and it was
Mhm.
really interesting to see. And so that story is not in A Beautiful Year, mostly because I just wrote it this year. But there are stories like that
Yeah.
all through this book that say, "Hey, look, we view time this way, or we view
Mhm.
this holiday this way." But did you know that for centuries and centuries and centuries, the Christian tradition actually carried a different story about this day? And to be able to pick up those stories and recall them in a non-imperial, non-authoritarian way that invites us to reflect on what might have gone wrong in our own tradition as Christians, but then in the broader world, as people who have been colonized by essentially the calendar of new Roman imperialism.
Yeah. Yeah. When you shared that, it was one of those things where it's like, wow, this is an amazing, inspiring little historical nugget. And look how good we are at ruining this feeling
Mhm.
that comes bubbling up. Um, and so, one of the things that recently happened was the last big No Kings
Mhm.
protest, and Sunday, and if we're on the liturgical calendar, is Christ the King Sunday, which is the crescendo,
Mhm.
the church year before Advent begins. Like if we start to take seriously the way the rhythm and calendar of our lives as Christians has been occupied by an alternative vision of power, like what are the connections you see from 7 million people thinking, oh, we might be 250 years in this experiment, but it might be good to say no kings, and a church that it gathers every year as it goes through the cycle to talk about uh, the one king that's rather opposite of well, at least the vision of power most people that wear crowns express.
Hey, you're gonna love this. I don't think that you know this yet. At least I hope you don't, because I love to be able to break this news to you. The Michigan State House, just I think it was yesterday, voted to make Christ the King Sunday a day to be celebrated by Michiganders. a day marked by the state of Michigan. And it wasn't about alternative kingship. They pointed out that as Christ has dominion over the world, so we in Michigan should celebrate this kind of kingship. And so basically, they called for the people of the state of Michigan to celebrate Christ the King Sunday as basically Jesus is our Caesar Day. And
Yeah.
yeah, and it's actually a real legal proclamation now that was passed by the represent. I'm really terribly sorry to tell that to you, Michiganders, if you haven't yet heard this about your own state house. Um, but yeah, this is how wacky and completely the Christian nationalism has become part of the narrative of MAGA and this moment of I mean, I don't even like saying Christian nationalism. This is Christian authoritarianism and Christian militarism. So then you ask yourself the question, what do you do if you're like an Episcopalian and you've got Christ the King Sunday? Well, you know exactly what to do, Episcopalians and Lutherans and UCCs and Presbyterians and everybody else, is that your job is now crystal clear, as you've got to get out and you've got to preach against that proclamation. And that proclamation is heresy according to Christian scripture,
Yeah.
because Jesus is a king who kneels at the feet of his disciples. He washes them as if he is their slave. And at that same event, he says that God will not even call you servants anymore, but instead, I now call you friends. And if we think about the radicalness of that kingship, what king in human history has ever gotten down on his knees and washed the filthy, dirty, unshoed feet of his followers while calling them friends? And so when we talk about Christ the King, that's what we're talking about. The exact opposite, a complete really, Jesus completely destroys the notion of kingship. And so when I think the word king is even used in the New Testament, I think we have to start looking for it as an ironic use, um, or a kind of use where people would actually stumble over it, because nobody would think about that. Nobody would think, that's the kind of kingship that God would have God's own child be elevated to. It's not it's it's beyond our comprehension almost.
Yeah. Oh God, that makes me sick.
I knew
I
it would. I
like
knew I knew you'd love it.
I would just like to say on behalf of all the Baptists who remember our history, there's a real reason we did not want the church calendar being connected to a country's calendar.
Right.
And there's a host of reasons. One, we actually wanted the church to be full of disciples. And then the idea that you're going to in a state, especially a state with so many Muslim citizens in it, that you're going to tell them that this is Christ the King Sunday. That's ridiculous. But
I know that's a
under
really terrible thing, isn't it, Trip?
yes,
I
like
mean, this
the
is one of
same
the
time the Republicans are
states.
going nuts on Islamophobia. I
Right.
oh man,
This is
uh,
one of the times where our poor Islamic neighbors are just really, struggling. And I mean, that also ICE. Been a national directive apparently that has gone out. It was a story broke last night about this by a local newspaper up in New England. That ICE is planning a special kind of, what would you call it? A crusade? I don't know what you call it. Um, there- Against churches during the holiday months. They've actually planned to go into communities of faith and round up immigrants during the time period between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And it was almost like an answer to the Pope, who came out, and the Catholic bishops who came out in recent weeks and said, do not do this. This is leave immigrants in churches in particular alone, and allow us to celebrate the Eucharist with anyone who's in prison for these particular, what you're calling infractions of the law. And so the Trump administration comes out, and what are they doing? They're having sort of like Operation Round Them Up in Jesus' name. I mean, round them up in the name of the Prince of Peace. Okay.
Jesus Christ.
I know this is what
Theologically.
no, really. I mean, turning Christ the King Sunday into domination over Muslim Sundays, and round up immigrants during the most sacred and beautiful and family-oriented time of the year in their church buildings, when they're listening to things like the Virgin Mary say, the mighty will be cast down from their thrones and the poor will be lifted up. And so, anybody who thinks that any of this is Christian you're nuts.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just, this is so far out of the vein of anything that the church has ever thought of Christian. The medieval people did it better, because at least they put phony fasts on to keep people from fighting all the time. But no, we decide, oh no, it's a feast, and so we're going to go ahead and we're going to celebrate by locking people up and ripping them away from their families. And so, yeah, really, tell me about it. Like I said, not even the medieval church thought of anything that nasty to do in the name of Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that kind of strikes me in like a befuddling way about this is the gospel stories themselves depict disciples who get the title of Jesus correctly, but the actual content of what it means for him to be the Christ wrong. Like, that's like the gimmick through the synoptics is Peter says, "You're the Christ, Son of the living God." And then Jesus goes, "Hey, my heavenly Father revealed that to you." And then a few chapters later, you have the Mount of Transfiguration, and he says it turns towards Jerusalem. And then Pete's like, "Hey, I don't think this is a good idea. If you go to Jerusalem, they might kill you. This is ridiculous. This is bad." Right. And then Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Right. Like, there's this whole, like, the gospel stories, like, one of these central features is Jesus trying to get it through the dudes that hung out with him the whole time, what it means for him to be the Christ. Jesus begins right with the temptations, where these other ways of being the Christ, one of which is literally being Caesar. And Satan's like, "Hey, if you just bow the knee, I could put you in charge. Don't you think it would be better to have an imperial ruler that's as quality a person as you, Jesus?" And it's like, no basket. And so, like, if the gospels themselves say, like, the dudes that hung out with him all the time are so thick-skulled that they would like to project on their Savior and Lord a content of his mission that turns you into a "get behind me, Satan" disciple, then perhaps there's a reason we read it all the time, because we might do the same. And then you get something as asinine as this. I'm self-editing because we're on a live stream and there's 600 people watching me. Otherwise, we might try to organize a heresy council.
Yeah, I wasn't so self-editing a minute ago, because
I was editing out F-bombs.
Oh,
I know my mom will listen to episodes with you on it,
Oh, that's true. Hi, Mom. And so I like your parents a lot. They're my age. We're peers.
One of the things about this is, and actually, I think it like really helps. It makes sense as to why in the Advent class each week we're looking at how each of the four Gospels introduces the story of Jesus, because all the Gospels begin with some way of going, "We're about to tell you what God looks like in sandals, and I promise it's not what you're expecting."
That's right.
And whether it's the cosmic picture in John that you're going to talk about, or let me play with all the things that apparently happened to Caesar and his deification, but let's do it with shepherds, so that, to me, like, one of the gifts of at the beginning of the church year, looking at how all four of our canonical Gospels begin the Jesus story, is to help us get that we canonized four different witnesses that you would never think they line up perfectly. Therefore, this is what we literally believe, and therefore defend this. But what they do with the resonance that goes across it is the invitation to follow Jesus is a whole different way of being human. If what you think superiority or kingliness or divinity looks like is one that conquers and builds crosses, it's actually one that serves and creates a community of friends and bears crosses. They're
Yeah.
very different images of power and a different invitation to what the full life that's available to us is there. And so, like, to me, one of the things I'm excited about is each week just pausing to go, how does each one of these gospels set the stage in their own voice for just how alternative of a vision the person of Jesus makes space for?
You see, this is one of the things I actually really love about the Christian year is that, I mean, you could think of it as a practice that is just a structure. It's in effect, it's a calendar that's circular that gives you a sort of a holding space to experience the story over and over and over and over again. And it's the same in that way that you can think about the Eucharist as just, oh well, it's bread and it's wine, or it's bread and it's grape juice, and so it's something that's tangible, that is essentially ingestible, that you know makes a difference if you just think of it on that level. But the Christian year, where we start with Advent, of course, it is not only a structure about returning every year to Advent and rethinking what Advent is about, but it takes you into the story again. And over 3 years, you go over the three different synoptic gospels. And so you get these divergences each year. And this year, actually, I preached a sermon for day one for the first Sunday of Advent that has not yet appeared on the radio, but will the weekend of November 30th. And I literally thought it was the Luke year. So I apologized to the people. I said, oh, I'm sorry, this one doesn't match the lectionary because, I was preaching from Matthew, and they said, I said, and it's a Luke year. And they go, no, actually it's a Matthew year. I go, oops. So I forget too. But so there's the structure, which is circular, but then there's the story. And the story spins on it. It takes what we think we know and spins it on a different axis. And I love that. And we're going to just, kind of introduce those three themes, and then the Gospel of John, which is the Gospel of John's story of Christmas shows up every year, which I love. It shows up on either the evening service on Christmas Day or the Sunday after Christmas. And so the synoptics get their full month, and then the Gospel of John, in effect, gets the last word of the Christmas story during Christmas season itself, which Christmas season are 12 days that follow Christmas. There are no such thing as 12 days of Christmas before Christmas. So that's just a PSA from your friendly neighborhood Episcopalian.
Yes, which sets up for Epiphany, which
That's right.
which could be really triggering to certain members of our church and country currently, because the wise man are discovered wise precisely by kneeling by a manger and deceiving Herod in his desire to stamp out an alternative king.
Don't tell the story before we
Yeah, we'll be hush hush.
It's a secret.
Yeah, the other day, we were getting out. We've been moving stuff all around our house and having all these things. We're trying to figure out what of the stuff from when we lived in Scotland are we keeping, and the stuff we put in storage before. And then we're getting out the Christmas things and going like, how do we do this? And I realized we had like parts of 4 or 5 different nativity sets.
Oh,
And it's like,
fun.
which ones are complete and this kind of thing. And so we're sitting there and I'm moving boxes, and Haven, our 8-year-old, says, do all these go together? And my back's turned, and I'm like, Haven, that's a great question. Well, nativity sets usually do combine the characters from the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew, and they never really hang out at the same manger because they each have different points, and it's important to see them in different ways. But you can remember the multiplicity of testimonies in this, and I turn around and realize he's not talking about shepherds and wise men hanging out. He's like, well, we got little like precious moment one, we got like adult plastic ones, we got carved wood ones, and so he kind of like looks at me and goes, well, uh, we can have a bunch of different kinds of shepherds and wise men, but we probably should just have one Jesus. But anyone of different kinds can all come to Jesus, but it would be weird to have more than one baby Jesus, right? And I was just like,
Oh,
Haven, I'm going to use this in a story at some point.
I gotta tell you, that's a better sermon than the one you just preached.
I know. I was sitting there going like, I hate when nativities ruin the uniqueness of each gospel. And he's just like, well, we could have the different kinds of shepherds and magi all hanging out. And I was like, oh, thanks, Abe.
The little hand carved ones and the ones that came from Mexico and the precious moments, they can hang out all together.
Yeah.
But honestly, that's the same kind of crazy stuff that would happen at my house. My daughter would get to the point with me sometimes when I turn around when I was answering a question like that, and her eyes would just be rolling, and she was hilarious because she would chastise me if I would ever put the wise men at the manger at the wrong time. So it's like, oh my gosh, I created a liturgical Nazi.
Well, there are worse things.
That's true. Well, you want me to, can I read a little bit from my Advent introduction and then before we close? Just to give people a sense of what I love. This Advent is my absolute favorite season of the church year. And I cheated in my book. I wrote more essays for Advent than I should have. And my editor had to pull more of them out because I loved it so much that I just kept trying to sneak stuff in. Anyway, let me just share a few paragraphs here. When the calendar reaches December, we begin thinking about the end of the year. How many shopping days until Christmas? Am I ready for final exams? To what charity should I donate? Are my taxes in good order? What to serve my holiday guests for dinner? Do I have a date for New Year's Eve? December is the month to wrap things up. Not only gifts, but loose ends. We rush to finish every project before the calendar turns. The Christian year, however, does something else. It begins. Most contemporary people, including many Christians, have forgotten that the Christian year starts with Advent on a day at the end of November or the beginning of December. The new year arrives a month early. Even though Advent begins a new liturgical year, it also anticipates endings. Oppression and war will end. The angels sing of peace on earth. The long wait for the Messiah is coming to an end. Mary is heavily pregnant with child. Joy to the world, the ancient promises of God are about to be fulfilled. The first of the year anticipates the ending of our waiting for God to show up. Despite the angels and the birth of the baby, however, the world would go on as muddled and conflicted and violent as before. Why? Isn't Advent the end of this wretched beginning of human history? Advent raises questions. Jesus' first followers found this as confusing as we do today. As they ruminated on his life and death, and the dreadful circumstances of the world continued, they wondered if sacred time was the same as human time. If perhaps God's commonwealth arrived not in a single act of history, but in some other more mysterious fashion, stretched out through time in ways hard to apprehend. There would be two Advents, the one that has happened at the birth of Jesus and the fulfillment of the promise that is still to come. And so Advent is about both, waiting for a birth and more waiting for peace. And even after you think the gift has arrived, there's still more waiting.
Yeah, I was snapping for everyone. It's like
Thank you.
poetry share kind of thing. So that really gets at the kind of cyclical cycle element that you've talked about and getting it there. And because that was in my head this morning, I was talking to N.T. Wright, and which we were supposed to talk about Ephesians, and then I just changed the subject to Advent. And part of it is in Ephesians, you have this kind of eschatological ecclesiology. It's one of these places where
Mhm.
the big picture of what the resurrection life and this kind of like emphatic invitation to participate in it, like that you get to be a part of the resurrected body of Christ in the present and anticipate the fullness of one and all, right, coming to participate in it. And I said, so like, what is this? It seems to me it might just be, I'm thinking about it, there's a lot of Advent energy in Ephesians. And his answer, but after it, I was like, oh, you should really check out Diana's new book. He said, I think Advent, I think that Christians would be better served if we just admitted we have a 13-month calendar, because Advent is the end of every church year and the beginning of the next one at the same time.
Oh, that's really interesting. I thought about putting something like that in the book because I think it really functions that way. And
Mhm.
there's certainly overlap at the end of Pentecost, these last 2 or 3 weeks that we've been going through. You start beginning to build this anticipatory energy of the end of empire. And that becomes, just such a more dominant theme in Advent, which you and I are going to have fun exploring.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm super pumped about it. So everyone that's already on here live, listening or watching later, feel free to come join us. You can go to homebrewedclasses.com. I'm sure to be linked wherever you're watching or listening to this. And it's kind of open to anyone and everyone. Each week we'll look at a different gospel and how that gospel kicks things off and frames the Jesus story. And we'll get on. One of us will set it up, then we'll start talking, then we'll answer questions. And I mean, I think there's already over 1,000 people have signed up. So, get your theological FOMO and don't feel left out. Come join live, and then it'll be at this time. So the 600 of you that are now on the stream, you're already available at this time, so you can join live. But if you aren't, you can always join. You can join. You'll get sent the video and the audio to engage with it whatever time you want. And
Are we
I
going to tell which weeks we're each doing, or are we keeping that a secret?
Let's see. I have to look at the order. Is it
I know
okay?
which
It
2
goes
I'm doing.
week 1's Matthew,
Mhm.
and I'm doing that one.
I thought I was doing Matthew.
Oh, then maybe I'm doing Mark.
I think you're doing Mark.
Okay.
I can trade though. I mean,
I
people can tell how organized we are right now.
I know you were insistent on John,
Yes.
and but I'm more than happy to do Mark. My first published article was on the opening of Mark.
Oh, see, actually, we should do it that way then.
It came out of my master's dissertation, which was like a post-colonial Christology of
Oh,
the
fantastic.
evangelists, which fits the Advent and Empire thing.
I think that for me, the Matthew and the John, over recent years, those have become the 2 gospels that are the most compelling to me for interesting reasons.
Mhm.
One is because I really am just fascinated by the Jewish backgrounds of Matthew and the whole understanding how a Jew would have understood what Jesus was all about in the first century. So I love Matthew for that reason. But then John, that's just I love John because all the stuff about Mary Magdalene, and I won't give that store away because we'll have a great time talking about John right before Christmas.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'm super pumped about it. This is like the preview of sorts
Mhm.
to the class, and our goal in it is not just to introduce those texts and the unique voices of each of them in the Advent season, but like the beautiful year, the Christian story, rhythm, and narrative and time isn't just there for us to rest in; it's also to orient us in the world we're in.
Yeah.
And so it'll be on us in our conversation and y'all and the kind of questions and responses we get to unpack it, but also to let it orient how we're engaging these times. And Lord knows if someone starts using nativity gatherings at churches for mass people to come in and take people away, oh, see, that is an
Yeah.
advent. Yeah, that's a good time to have Mark, because Mark,
Mhm.
he's got that apocalyptic aggression right from the start. So now,
I
okay.
think it's gonna be really last night I on a group chat with a whole bunch of people who write about Christian nationalism and authoritarianism and Christian fascism and stuff. And last night we were talking about this coming Christmas season with this story that broke. Um, yeah, and one person there who's very well known, who I don't want to quote because that person didn't give me permission, said things are about to get really ugly. And all I could think of was, well, that's kind of Advent too.
Hmm.
It's the most beautiful, and yet the counter to it is some of the ugliest stuff that happens in the Bible.
Yeah. All righty.
Ooh,
Well, look at this. We're only 1 minute over an hour, Diana.
I can't believe it.
I almost changed the subject completely, like I was just warmed up. But I just want Richard to notice that I noticed we were at an hour and didn't start another 30-minute conversation.
Because we've got 4 weeks of
Yeah.
conversation coming.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you all for hanging out. Homebrewedclasses.com. There'll be links around. And if for some reason you're sitting on the anxious bench of getting a beautiful year, be strangely warmed and go get it. Feel free not to get it from Bezos.
Order from Barnes and Noble if you want it soon, because Bookshop is back ordered and we're having trouble getting it in stock through Bookshop. So Barnes and Noble for the corporate online thing, and your local bookseller can probably get it to you quicker than some of the than Bookshop. And I know that a lot of you are boycotting Amazon for Advent. So know that even authors are with you.
All right.